In order to be well prepared to mitigate attacks against servers, against networks, we first have to have an understanding of the types of attacks that can occur and how they're executed. So let's talk about distributed denial of service attacks, otherwise called DDoS attacks. We've already learned about what a bot or a zombie is. A bot or a zombie is an infected computer under malicious user control. And when you have a collection of those, you have a botnet. Now, a botnet means you have a lot more horsepower because you have a lot more infected computers under your control. From a malicious user standpoint, you have a lot of computers, an army of computers. It could be dozens, hundreds, it could be thousands. You can imagine the difference between one infected computer flooding a website with useless traffic to try to bring it down versus 10,000 machines doing the same thing at the same time. It's going to be way more effective with 10,000. And as terrible as it is, botnets are for rent on the dark web, believe it or not. And it happens every day. It's just not always reported. Anyway, we're talking about flooding a network or a victim with useless traffic so the real legitimate traffic can't get in. Now, there have been episodes over the years, one of which is against or was against a very popular gaming type of website. It was for putting bets about who would win certain sports events. The site was for BetCris, the company. And what happened is some of their competitors at one point allegedly rented botnets, flooded them on a day when all those wagers, all those bets were to be made through their website. Of course, customers couldn't make bets because the site was flooded. So therefore, that was a distributed denial of service attack. It's absolutely terrible. And what can you do about it? Because sometimes it's a low and slow attack. Low and slow, what's that mean? Well, the way that we mitigate DDoS attacks usually is by throttling. That's one method. What that means is we're just looking at the rate of traffic that is beyond what is normal. And it might look suspiciously excessive. And so we slow it down. We might even start discarding some traffic. Now that's a problem. It's not perfect because it could mean legitimate traffic is also being discarded. Another option is to mitigate DDoS attacks with what's called black hole routing. Same kind of idea where we are looking at traffic and trying to figure out which is the good and which is the bad. And hopefully we're determining what the bad traffic really is, and we are routing it to nowhere. That's called black hole routing. It is a way to mitigate DDoS attacks. So if we take a look at a diagram of a DDoS attack, we have the attacker that has access to a botnet. Again, that could be thousands of infected machines under their control. And those machines would go to a command and control server, as we learned about, get instructions, for example, on flooding a victim network or host, and they would go ahead and do it at the scheduled date and time. So that's how this all happens against the poor victim or target. Now, another type of common attack is URL hijacking. We all know that we can remember names or text strings better than we can remember numbers. Think about connecting to twitter.com versus connecting to whatever the IP address is for that. DNS is important because it does that resolution. So one type of attack will stem from the fact that users type in something incorrect. For example, if they misspell youtube.com, it might take them to another site that could be malicious that looks like the real YouTube and still asks you to sign in, but it's just harvesting or stealing user credentials. That's possible. That's one form of URL hijacking. Another one would be tainted search results from a DNS query. Imagine that an attacker somehow compromises a DNS server. That's scary. That's like an attacker somehow taking over the old school yellow pages where you've got addresses for companies and phone numbers, taking it over and filling it with fake information. So this means that if an attacker compromises a DNS host, they can put in fake DNS records, maybe for www.bankofamerica.com, that redirects to an IP under their control that is a fake site that looks just like the real McCoy. That's what that can do. So it can be a very scary situation. That's why we need to harden DNS servers. Everything really should be hardened, all types of devices. Now, you might also hear the term typo squatting as well. That term is really more related to the first example where people are misspelling a site, maybe not even noticing that they did because a fake site that looks the same popped up. That's another set of common attacks. Then there are session replay attacks. We're talking about a victim having an authenticated session of some kind, say with a secured website. It could be a banking session online. So what an attacker might do is compromise that user system, break into it. There are plenty of ways to trick users where you can hijack their web browser with a single click. As a matter of fact, it is possible to hijack a web browser with the user simply visiting a website, not even clicking on anything. Absolutely possible. That's scary. Anyway, so what an attacker might do, having compromised or hijacked a user's web browser, is they might have access to cookies, which have very sensitive information about that authenticated banking session, for example. Or the attacker might form a URL and trick the user to click it, the link, or they might input data into an HTML web page form field that sends malicious content to a site. Maybe that content would state to the bank, hey, send an e-transfer or a y-transfer to this account, which would be under the ownership of the malicious user. These things do happen. So how do we mitigate this? Well, it's really more of a web app / software developer type of solution. And it really deals with how cookies are treated. Cookies are little text files on machines where there are web browsers running. And so if a developer sets the HTTP only flag, what this means is we can set it so that JavaScript access to cookies is not allowed in the browser. And JavaScript is a client-side scripting language that is often used to execute a lot of these types of attacks. Another common attack is the pass the hash attack. Now this means that we are somehow taking advantage of password hashes. Now remember, when a user enters a password in some environments, when that password is stored either in memory or the authentication server, the password itself is not stored. Instead, the password is fed through a hashing algorithm, and the resultant hash is what is stored. And when a user authenticates in some environments, that hash is sometimes resident in memory. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that an attacker could compromise a system that has a current active user login session. For example, older versions of Windows Server and client operating systems are susceptible to this because what happens is they would store the user password hash in memory. But if we have an authenticated session, we don't even need to figure out the password. We can actually take that hash from memory, hand it off to other network resources, and if that user whose hash we just stole from memory has access to other resources, so do we, just by passing the hash. We don't even have to crack the password. Luckily, newer versions of Windows don't allow that to happen. So if we look at a diagram in step 1, the attacker somehow has to gain access to a machine where a user has an authenticated session. They have to have access in the first place somehow to be able to retrieve that password hash from memory. But if they do have access to the host because perhaps it's already compromised, it's child's play to take that hash out of memory and use it to gain access to other items on the network. So mitigating this means using newer versions of operating systems and patching them all of the time. Then we have the notion of a managed security service provider, an MSSP. Now in the cloud, this means we have security as a service, as they call it. The idea is that we want to outsource a lot of the security, such as DDoS black hole routing as a mitigation. We want to outsource that to a third party, and that third party is called the MSSP. So it's cybersecurity outsourcing, where we might be able to get services like 24/7 security monitoring, looking for suspicious activity. The company that we outsource this to might also run periodic vulnerability scans or penetration tests against our network, so we know how secure we are or are not. And also, we get reports that are generated from the results of those pen tests and vulnerability assessments. So having an understanding of some common attacks and how they are executed goes a long way in helping you to secure or mitigate against those attacks.